To High Tea with Dirk and Rens, a podcast about cannabis culture. My name is Dirk Bergman.
And my name is Rens Hoppenbrouwers. This episode is sponsored by Seedstockers, affordable cannabis seeds for home growers, available at seedstockers.com.
We are delighted to have a very, very special guest in the High Tea podcast studio for this episode, all the way from Canada, Hilary Black. Welcome to the show, Hilary.
Thank you, gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here.
You are here for the big cannabis conference that the National Coffee Shop Union PCN is organizing here in Eindhoven tomorrow. So you have been here, I think, 2 days now. What's your impression of the city of Eindhoven?
Oh, it is lovely. I find the people so far are very warm. I've been standing around a couple of times with my phone trying to figure out where I am on my map, and somebody has come up and said, "Are you looking for something? Can I help you figure out where you're going?" I've managed to not get hit by a bicycle, which it always takes a minute to figure out the flow of traffic when you come to Holland. But it's very beautiful, and I love the fashion. The women here are so stylish. It's much more casual in Canada, but also everybody manages to wear running shoes, sparkly running shoes, flashy, sexy running shoes with your dresses or your jeans or whatever you're wearing. You still have like comfortable footwear so you can boot around the town.
Oh, it's interesting. Yeah.
You have founded Canada's very first medical cannabis dispensary, the BC Compassion Club in Vancouver, back in 1997, or I say 99.
Yeah, 97.
Yeah? Okay. Before that, you worked at the legendary Positronics grow shops of Bernard Bruining, and more recently you worked for Canopy Growth.
So a true cannabis veteran. With a unique insight, I would say, into the cannabis scene in Canada. We will obviously focus on Canada in this Canada special, but we will first discuss the biggest cannabis news stories that we had since episode 66.
The German health minister presented the cornerstones for the planned legalization of the adult use cannabis on October 26.
And here in the Netherlands, Bulldog founder Henk de Vries is suing Red Bull energy drinks for 49 million euros as a starter. And the growers who are taking part in the Dutch wietexperiment have asked the government for more support to tackle all the practical problems and issues they are facing.
And as always, you can listen to our regular segments, What's in Your Joint Today, the history segment, The Old Box, listeners' responses, and the High Tea podcast Kweekhoekje, our homegrown segment.
This is High Tea with Dirk and Rens, episode 67.
Welcome everybody again to a new episode in English again.
Yep.
I say, Simon, let's start with the first
segment.
Wat zit er in jouw joint vandaag?
And of course, we always start with the guest. Hilary, what are you smoking today?
Oh, well, I hope I'm not a terrible disappointment, but I'm not smoking anything today. I have intentionally really lowered my tolerance so that I can consume a very small amount of cannabis and get very high. So it's generally an evening thing for me, or maybe on a weekend, maybe in the morning if I want to absolutely do nothing that day. But I find that my tolerance is so low that depending on the strain, I might just stop being able to talk at all, which would not be convenient on a podcast. But I consume cannabis and then I like to play with my dog or dance in the kitchen or hug my boyfriend. It's not something that is functional for me anymore. It's just strictly for playtime. And this podcast is serious business. So
absolutely.
So nothing in my joint today.
When you say consume, are you like a joint smoker or a vaporizer, an edible person? What's your favorite way of consumption?
I have all of the tools and vaporizers at home, but I am a old school joint smoker.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You tend to have that too, eh? Yeah. Rens, What about you? Do you have something to smoke? I think you do, eh?
I really have something really nice. And I went yesterday all the way to France to get something. Now I had a really nice weekend in Barcelona. And on the way back we stopped in France to drop off my friend La Chanvrière. And I had some... when I left, I grabbed some nice sunsets.
It's almost a staple on the show.
Yeah, if he has a new batch, I always very eager to
sunsets.
get to get some sunsets.
What a great strain!
And so there's no better weed to start the day with than the sunsets.
Totally, it's also good for the show, I'd say. And to me, I actually bought some in-between weed, as I like to call it, because we get into that with the high tea podcast Kweekhoekje, of course. But it's harvest time. Oktober is gone, so a lot of people, I think, are trimming or have trimmed. So for me, I'm waiting for my own homegrown weed to get dry enough to smoke. But pretty much all the other weed is gone. So then I have to get some in-between weed. So I went to like a local coffee shop and they had blue gelato on the menu, which is, if you look at, the original hybrid, is very interesting, should be very good. But, it's not. So I was going to smoke it on the show, but when you came out and said, "Hey, I have some French weed," I'm smoking sunsets as well. So there's a big smile on my face, and I hope all the listeners also have something nice to smoke or vape on or nibble.
I have to say that blue gelato is the most terrible gelato I ever seen in my life. Also for the listeners, please watch out if there's a name, like for example, blue or red or yellow or whatever. With gelato, there's only a number behind it. It's for
41.
the pheno, and maybe it's been crossed. But most of the time, at this time, if you find any blue gelato, you can mostly know it's from Barney seeds, and it's probably a good critical. Anyways, we go to the news segment. Yeah, and very, very big news from Germany. Just a few days after our podcast with Nienke, the Minister of Health presented the outline for the legalization of cannabis on October the 26th.
Indeed. Herr Karl Lauterbach is his name, the German health minister. I watched, they streamed it live, the press conference. And to me, it was really, you could say, it's a historic moment when a health minister is so well informed and so serious about this issue. So what they call it in German the Eckpunkte. So indeed the cornerstones, the main points of the way they want to legalize adult use cannabis in Germany. And a few of these corner points are the possession and buying of 20 to 30 grams. So there's not a figure yet, like one figure, 20 to 30 it'd be. He did not give a timeline for the plan, and Germany will present the paper, the cornerstone paper, to the European Commission for pre-assessment, and will only draft a law once the Commission approves the plan, he explained. What's in there, what I think is very interesting, is they had a leaked version before, like I'd say about a week to 10 days before the actual presentation. And there in this version, they had a maximum THC percentage of 15% for all weed. And this was one of the points that got a lot of criticism, rightly so, of course, because these limits are really nonsensical. And
maybe only if you make rosin or hash from it.
Yeah, but it's everybody agreed, most of the experts indeed in Germany, that you really help out the black market if you want to, do something about that. So in the version, like the official cornerstone document, that was gone. But maybe they want to do it for 18 to 21 years olds. So
also super
yeah, it's not necessary. But for the home growing, in the leaked version, it was 2 plants and nothing else, just these 2 words. And now in this sort of official version, it's 3 female flowering plants, which is, of course, it has a lot of benefits for any home grower to have that in the law, because you can have all the clones you want, and you can have like
Others.
you can have the mother plant and always be growing your own. So that's very good. And I think also input from activists helped in that respect. What could be problematic is, of course, that they are going to present it to the European Commission, and what will their reaction be? That's what we're waiting on. But he also explained that in case the European Commission says no, it's not that they're not going to legalize, but then they'll make a proposal that's slightly different. And it comes down to really the interpretation of the EU rules around drugs, and also the UN treaties about drugs. And their main line of reasoning is that they say the goals of those conventions and rules, we get them much better if we regulate, instead of doing what we have done for the last 60 to 70 years, only repression. And imagine that the European Commission would say, yeah, this is a good interpretation, we have nothing against it. Then it would be like green light for all the European countries to go down this road and legalize. So very exciting times. And
so it might be the blueprint of the legalization of Europe.
Yeah, you could say that. But even more so, I would say, if they do get this sort of green light from the European Commission, it means that other countries can have like maybe 5 flowering plants or 10 flowering plants, whatever, and 50 grams. But in general, the idea is accepted that that is more harm reduction if you regulate than if you have the total repressive policy, like so many countries still have. So good news, and we don't know yet, because to make that clear, this is not the law proposal yet. So this is, like the cornerstones document. These are the general outlines of what they want to do. But for the law proposal, we still have to have a bit more patience.
We will.
Incredibly exciting.
Yeah.
Watching prohibition begin to crumble bit by bit, year over year across the globe is such... It's incredible for social justice, for the environment, for patients. You know, I really think that it's one of the most meaningful things that we can do to be a part of solutions in a time when the world is facing a lot of troubles. So
absolutely,
way to go, Germany.
Yeah.
Yes, really.
And still surprising, that to me it came as a surprise, I must say. I would say that Spain, with the social clubs for such a long time, would be a more obvious choice to be the first to legalize. And then, as we report on the show, of course, Malta, who would have thought that, the tiny island country of Malta, they actually were the very first European country to legalize. But it's super strict and it's not really coming off the ground. But yeah, for the history books, Malta got the prize. And then probably Germany as the second.
Yeah. The Netherlands lost.
It's ironic, hey?
Yeah, really ironic. News from the Netherlands about Henk de Vries, the founder of the Bulldog. Everyone knows him. He's doing well very lately. He's doing well. In episode 66, we reported how he got into the Dutch weed experiment with the company Gaan, maar, and now he is suing Red Bull for almost $50 million.
Now euros, even more.
Oh, euros.
Yeah, well, it's the same these days, I think. Euro and dollar is the same thing. Yeah, it's an incredible story, really. I remember this in 2003.
I'm drinking Red Bull right now.
Yeah, but you're not drinking Bulldog energy drink.
I never tried it.
No, because you probably couldn't have. In 2003, he launched it. And from the moment that he started selling a few cans, immediately the lawyer team from Red Bull came down on him, like a pack of wild dogs, and said, you have to immediately get this product off the market. It has the word bull in it. We are Red Bull. You cannot do it. We are older than you are. Get it off the market. And initially they won. So that's why Henk de Vries went on to do other things. But he didn't give up the fight in court. He'd still go to different courts and trying to say, what's this bullshit? Red Bull is not the same as the Bulldog. My logo is very different. My logo is a lot older than the Red Bull logo, because the coffee shops, of course, have been going
70s.
Since the early 70s. And just a few months ago, I think, he was at the European Court of Justice, and they said, well, Mr. de Vries, you are right. All this is bullshit. And now so that's why he's suing now for 49 million euros. And he also laid claim to the assets and the bank accounts of Red Bull. And the latest development in this incredible saga is that Red Bull went to court over this claiming of their bank accounts. And the judge said this week, Mr. de Vries, you are totally right to do it. Because the 49 million, they are not likely to pay it. So, yeah, it's a normal procedure. And there's an Amsterdam-based economic firm that has made all the what you call it, what he would have lost since 2003. You know what he would have made if he just had the Bulldog energy drink, and they came to a figure of 300 million euros. So it really looks like Henk de Vries will not just get the 49, but will go all the way for the main prize and get 300 million euros of Red Bull. And this was all reported by Dutch magazine Quote, and they asked Henk de Vries for commentary with the last victory, and he didn't want to say anything to the press out of respect for the founder of Red Bull, the guy from Austria, who had recently died. Which I thought was also an interesting way of doing it. So
it's classy.
I say, good for Henkie de Vries.
I hope we get him on the show one day. That would be amazing.
I think he would do it.
Yeah, we're gonna ask him. But yeah, I hope Henk bring me a Bulldog energy drink. I'm curious. I can be your biggest fan. All right, and now we go to the final story. We have a very short news segment this
because
episode.
we need a lot of time to talk about Canada.
True, yeah.
Otherwise, it's now Canada special.
Yeah, of course. Our final news story is about the Dutch wheat experiment. And it's no news that there are kinds of delay and that the growers are facing practical problems. Yeah, it's how it goes since the beginning, I think.
Yeah, they can't get a bank account. They have trouble finding a location because local politicians and authorities don't like the idea. But they are now facing new challenges, you could say, since the war in Ukraine. Energy prices through the roof, building materials gone up, hard to get staff in any kind of economic branch, but also just for building. So Dutch newspaper NRC reported on this and spoke to 3 growers that are in the experiment, and they wouldn't go on record, with their name, but they explained a lot of what's going wrong and what they have done. And news to me indeed was that there is a growers collective. We knew about that. 9 out of the 10 selected growers, they sort of work together, and one of the appointments they make is that they don't talk to the national press, while it's still also it's all very touchy and very difficult. But anonymously, they explained and said that they wrote a letter to the responsible ministers for the weed experiment, basically explaining their problems, but also saying we would like some more support from the government. It's like you're only obsessed with the original rules and coloring within the lines, as they say, and not on helping us to make this experiment a success. And the ministers, they have told the newspaper that they will inform the parliament in December about the rest of the planning of the experiment. Because, indeed, last month it was 5 years ago that they announced this experiment, and still only one grower is producing weed. And one of the things that they argue about, or that they don't agree upon now, is should we already start with the experiment if not all the 10 growers are ready to produce the wheat. And it was also reported in the paper that they don't really, some want to do it and some don't want to do it, because of course there's a sense of false competition.
But I think also the experiment has to be succeeded, or has to be successful.
Be a success, yeah.
So if they have only one supplier and that's one supplier is not growing well enough, then they don't have any choice, and then the experiment is automatically a fail. So they have to wait at least for 6 companies. So I think that's what will be happening. I think that's only the best solution, and for everyone, also for the coffee shop owners. They also don't want to get weed all from one company. Then
Pedro can
sell your coffee shop and buy and open a cigarette store. If you want to do that. So I think it's best for all to wait. It takes long. It's incredible how many patients.
That's it.
the
How
people-
long can how long can it go on?
And indeed, the funds are. They need. Yeah, it's incredible. Yeah.
The headline
Frustrating,
on
say
the
that.
front page of the NRC newspaper was something like, "Will there ever be legal weed in the Netherlands?" You know, like almost a desperate kind of a.
I'm still positive.
Question.
Like all the good things take some time to work out, and in a few years we don't even think about all the time we've waited before. I'm sure about that. Yeah. So have some patience. All the growers are really busy, trying their best, doing all the things they can, and I think the end of 2024, the weed. will
End
be
of
there.
2024.
Yeah, that's my hope.
Yeah,
We'll
your
see.
hope, but also your expectation.
yeah, but this, so I think that wraps up the news a bit, or do you want to continue about?
No. Let's dive straight into Canada and into
Hilary
the
Black.
world and journey of our guest today, Hilary. We'd like to, because we have the time on the podcast, we like to start at the beginning. So, could you tell us a bit about yourself as like a child growing up? Where and what kind of an idea should people get of your childhood?
Well, I grew up in Vancouver, and I would say that I was always bringing home friends who were having a hard time or broken animals. I was always finding something or some kind of creature to rescue as a youngster. And I started my path in kind of activism and protest quite early, finding local environmental issues to cause trouble about. I have a wonderful, supportive family. I would say that I grew up with quite a lot of privilege. I mean, my immediate family was not wealthy growing up, but I grew up in a very wealthy community, and my extended family was quite wealthy. So I grew up with a sense of power and privilege as a white middle to upper class woman growing up in a very safe neighborhood with successful, affluential community members and family all around me.
Yeah, it's a good start, obviously.
A lot of blessings.
Yeah. And when did sort of cannabis enter into your life? Can you remember even like the first time, maybe not even smoking it, but being aware that this plant exists?
I had a friend in high school, Dan, whose parents were international hash smugglers. Dan's dad eventually got busted with basically a freighter full of hash in the Vancouver harbor. But he used to break into his dad's safe and undo the cellophane from the bricks and slice bits of hash off the bricks. And
Nobody would know.
And then squish the edge of the brick back together and wrap it back up. And he would get in big trouble when his dad would go to do a deal and the brick was light. And he figured out that his kids were like slicing the edges of the hash bricks.
He could have died.
Yeah. Yeah, not good. But that family really introduced me to cannabis, and I will always give them credit for kind of starting me on this journey. And the first time that I ingested cannabis was at their house, because they were kind of the cool parents that let kids come over and consume cannabis or have a beer in the basement so they keep their eyes on them. But I didn't really have any effect the first time. The first time that I got high was at a Motley Crue concert. And I remember very distinctly, I was in grade 11. I was quite a nerdy student, like a real overachiever in school. So I didn't start consuming cannabis until kind of halfway through grade 12. I think I started consuming.
So what age would that be?
Like 17.
Yeah.
Started consuming a little bit more regularly. Yeah.
And then it was I would say hash from your story, or was it weed back then?
It started with hash.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Same.
Yeah.
Same.
And that's not
but
that's not common for like West Coast.
Yeah,
Like,
you hear so often from the States and from Canada that it's much more weed because it's so much longer distance to get the hash from the traditional producing countries.
The Nepalese hash that we purchased yesterday that I consumed some of last night, which is a bit tired today because I ended up staying up quite high in my hotel room last night. But it reminded me a lot.
Good Nepalese does that.
It reminded me a lot of that kind of hash that I first was introduced to. Yeah.
Yeah, the old school. So at one point you end up in Amsterdam. So I was wondering, how did you, when you were quite young, I think.
Yeah, well, I graduated high school and promptly ran away on Grateful Dead tour. It was the last year of...
For the very young listeners who don't know who the Grateful Dead were.
Yep.
Yeah, they're like a total... well, you explain.
Oh, God, how do you explain the Grateful Dead? I mean, they were almost like, I don't want to say a cult, but I mean, the following the Grateful Dead was like a incredible journey that probably hundreds of thousands of people committed to over their life.
American bands, Jerry Garcia, psychedelic sort of space rock kind of music. And yeah, like you say, the fans, they were called Deadheads. And like
real hippie culture.
Yeah.
And I think few very popular strains these days are from that area, from that time. Like the Gem 91, and probably more of them.
The OG strains.
Strains, yeah. So the Grateful Dead is really a big part of the rise and expanding of cannabis.
Of the cannabis culture.
And,
It was for me. So I went to a couple of shows on the West Coast, Oregon and California. And then in California, I was supposed to drive home with my friends. And instead, I got into the bus of the people parked next to me and drove to Vermont across the country. Called my mom from Vermont and told her like I was going to be away for a little bit longer. And we, sold all kinds of things in the parking lot, food and substances and things I might not admit on a public podcast.
Kind of things.
It's been eight.
Neat things.
It's now been eight.
And really it was Grateful Dead tour where I learned about hemp. And I learned hemp can save the planet, hemp for fuel, hemp for fiber, hemp for medicine, hemp for fun. And I came back to Vancouver and Mark Emery with his partner had started with Ian Hunter, who's not with us anymore, but Mark and Ian had started the first hemp store in Canada, Hemp BC, way back when. So this is like 95. So I just started showing up there, volunteering, dusting and tidying and organizing, and I just wanted to be a part of it. And eventually they hired me, and I worked at Hemp BC and eventually managed it for a number of years. And I learned about Todd McCormick, who at that time was in federal prison the first time. And I started writing him letters in jail, just like activist support. And we became very fond of each other. And when he got out of jail, he moved to Amsterdam. And we then would talk on the phone. This is actually before email, believe it or not, and definitely before like FaceTime. And he convinced me to leave my job managing Hemp BC and come and live and work in Amsterdam with him.
Okay.
And I'd actually never met him in person.
Wow.
And it was just long distance. And I thought I was in love. And so I moved to Amsterdam and met him for the first time in the airport. And we moved in together. And he was working on a magazine at the time. So we hung out at Positronics all the time. That was our local place. And he was really good pals with some very smart, influential people, with Robert Clark and Michael Rich and Old Ed. And we would sit around and talk. And that's when I learned about cannabinoids, and they did different things and had different effects. And eventually Bernard hired me,
Uh-huh.
and I was a Canadian. I didn't speak Dutch. I didn't have an EU passport. Some of the other people working there were not that keen on the special favors that I was getting.
Uh-huh.
But I worked in the cantina. So they, served snacks and lunch, and
Yeah.
also sold hash and grass and had a Mediweed program. And it was
And sold clones, I remember. I was lucky enough
The
to
clone library.
visit it quite a few times. And I must say that most grow shops in these days, like say the middle to late 90s, were all special. And most of them are gone now. But you just get growers and have like comfortable seating.
Yeah.
And have coffee and smoke joints and talk about plants the whole day.
Yeah.
And then at Positronics, because it was in Amsterdam and the very first, even the first grow shop in Europe, yeah, you must remember it as well. People came from all over, and it was such a special experience to have that. And then tragic for Bernard to lose the company because basically his employees stole it from underneath.
That's heartbroken when you told me that
Yeah,
last night.
yeah.
I didn't know that that's how the history unfolded.
And
No,
typical for Bernard because he cares not about money. So then he didn't see it what was going on. Yeah, too bad.
Well, by hiring me, he kind of changed the direction of my life in that I got to work. I was, 20 maybe, and I was distributing hash and grass, and it was totally normalized.
Yeah.
And it was this environment where like prohibition didn't exist. You're not hiding it. That's not under the table. You're not all sneaky. You're not scared. You're not feeling nervous. It's just like completely normalized.
Yeah.
And that experience, I took that back to Canada with me.
Because what made you go back?
Well, actually, Proposition 215 passed in California, which was the first piece
Yeah.
of pro-cannabis legislation. And so
It
Todd...
had started.
It had started.
Yeah.
So Todd wanted to go back to California and start working with the cannabis dispensaries. So he had a prescription in California and a prescription in Holland. So he took on the plane with him, because he's forever such an activist,
Yeah.
the stinkiest Tupperware full of 28 grams of super silver haze, because he wanted to make a point that
Yeah.
he should be able to travel internationally with it. And I separated from him as we were going through customs in California, or in LAX in California, and I'll never forget when he took the lid off that Tupperware and the whole border station just stunk. So it took us a few hours to get out of there, but eventually they let him go because
Wow.
I think they thought that he was just going to be more trouble than
Yeah.
he was worth.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I lived in Los Angeles for a little while, and Todd started up the Castle, which he turned into a clone factory to supply the local dispensaries. And I left to come home to Vancouver to start doing some medical cannabis work myself, a fairly short amount of time before the federal raid.
The big bust.
The big bus that put Todd in jail for the second time. I narrowly escaped that one. And, I wasn't allowed to talk about that publicly for a very long time, but my lawyer finally told me that I'm past the date where I
Okay.
can get in trouble for admitting that I was there.
Yeah, but it's a reality. Back then, it was still so much
Yeah.
worse, of course. Yeah.
The big bust.
Todd McCormick, he called it the castle as well, wasn't it?
It literally was a
Yeah.
castle. It was like built by some old crazy Hollywood star.
Yeah.
It was a little
In
weird
Bel Air.
castle in Bel Air. Yeah. Yeah, I lived there.
it's amazing. Like we have the cannabis castle here in the Netherlands, of course, of the Dronkers family. But this is to me was always when I read these stories, and I did meet Todd a few times at the High Times Cup. But this is amazing. So he had the clones there, and he just had a very, very big police raid, and they destroyed everything, I think.
Yeah, it was the feds came and raided it, even though technically what he was doing could be argued that it was legal in the state of California.
Yeah, because it was after Proposition 215 passed.
And the judge in that case refused to let him include anything about a medical defense and kind of threw the book at him. And then he did 5 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary.
Wow, yeah.
Yeah. And meanwhile, I came home to Canada and started the Compassion Club.
Yeah, because it's not. You must have thought about it this way beforehand. or how did the initial thing?
Well, actually, when I was working at Hemp BC, before I came to Amsterdam, people were coming to the hemp store looking for information about medical cannabis. So they were looking for, it was like HIV and AIDS patients, people living with cancer, elderly folks. So I read all the books that I could, read Dr. Grinspoon's books, and learned everything that I could so that I could give good advice. And I started with a friend of mine at that time, before Amsterdam, a delivery service. And we basically had I remember my old Motorola pager. And I'm really dating myself right now. And a backpack and a bicycle. And together we started distributing cannabis to people who were like really critically and chronically ill. So then I came to Amsterdam and learned a tremendous amount. Went to California, saw how the medical industry was getting started. And of course, Todd is incredibly knowledgeable. So I was always embezzling and siphoning expertise off of him. And then it was just time to come home and get busy in Vancouver. So I came home and rented a little tiny office and got some grower friends to front me some weed and made a little brochure. And I had quite good connections with some folks in the HIV and AIDS community and movement. So back then in the 90s, that was the health epidemic that was facing Canada. And there was a group of wonderful gay men who kind of like wrapped themselves around me and said like, you go girl, like you do this publicly and you go big and go loud. And if anything happens, like we're going to protest and hunger strike and chain ourselves to the front of your shop. And they really were like the wind beneath my wings that very much gave me the courage to be Canada's first out of the closet pot dealer. I was really the first person publicly saying the laws are wrong. I'm breaking them. I'm going to distribute cannabis. Come and see me if you're critically and chronically ill.
Yeah, because I was thinking before this was really not that much, that long after Todd was busted and had all this trouble. You could argue that it'd be a more normal response to say, "Ooh, this has been very close. I could have ended up in jail as well. Might do something completely else." Was it more than these men you talk about that sort of gave you enough courage to take that risk, or did you think that it was very different in Canada? Maybe that you wouldn't go to jail.
I wasn't smart enough to think about it that much, really. You know, one of the first patients that I ever distributed cannabis to was an older woman who had very bad arthritis, and she had been bedridden for a period of time. And she asked me to come to her house and bring some cannabis, and I brought a bag over and we looked at it and talked about it and rolled a joint and we consumed it together. And she started like moving and stretching kind of like a cat. It's almost like you could see these like chunks of cement falling off of her as she was like getting mobile for the first time in a long time. And she went to the kitchen and made tea on her walker, hobbled over, and then she carried the tea back to where we were sitting, and then she cried and cried and cried. It still makes me a little a little verklempt thinking about it. Because she had never, she hadn't been able to carry tea in months
such a long
and months.
time.
And then she went on this rant about how mad she was about this plant being kept away from her for so long and all of these lies that she believed about it. And really, it just was making her feel incredible. I was also a little intoxicated at the time. And in that moment, I felt like something land on me. And I got the gift of having a strong sense of purpose, of like something that I could do. And I imagined that prohibition was this wall that was keeping this plant away from an ocean of people that were suffering. And I just decided that I was going to kick the shit out of that wall until it came tumbling down.
Wow, yeah.
So I didn't really have a choice. I kind of feel like in that moment, if you don't mind if I get a bit spiritual for a moment, are we allowed to do that on this podcast? Of course. I feel like this spirit of Mama Ganja reached down and grabbed me and said, I'm claiming you to like spend your life being a warrior for me.
Yep. Working for the plant, as Doug Fine always says. She got you there. You were still working for the plant.
So I never worried about jail. And I think that comes from privilege. If I was a woman of color living in the States who did this work, I could have ended up with life in prison.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So it is about the privilege of being in Canada. It's the privilege of being white. It's the privilege of coming from an affluential community. It's the privilege of knowing that I have some very excellent lawyers in my family.
And being
right?
a girl, maybe.
And there was a softness to it. All of the staff in the beginning for the first couple of years were all women.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, wow. That's also interesting. Like you say, Mama Ganja, it's all about,
Yeah.
it's a female plant that we use.
But, very quickly we learned that am I getting the horn yet? Am I going on too long?
No.
No, please.
I'm worried about that horn. Yeah, I heard about what happens if you ramble on too long on this podcast.
I only do it with Derek. So,
Okay. Well, if you just start moving your hand towards it, I'll know to cut it short.
we only use it for the positive today.
We very quickly realized that most of the patients that we were working with had multiple layers of issues going on. So maybe a cancer diagnosis or hepatitis C. Some would also have a layer of a mental health issue. And many were living in dire poverty. Right. So we had some very affluential folks, it was all the spectrum of society was coming, but some were really marginalized and had a lot of hardships in their life. And so we started a wellness center. So we used the proceeds of the cannabis distribution, and we had doctors of traditional Chinese medicine, clinical herbalists, counselors, massage practitioners, and we funded the whole thing through the cannabis distribution and provided those health services for free or by donation. And that clinic, I think, was a part of what really proved the credibility and the authenticity that the cannabis was a part of one of the tools of healing that we were offering and providing people.
Different, I would say, from most American dispensaries where it might be a bit harder to see immediately that it's really medicinal and not,
Steve D'Angelo did the same thing at Harborside.
Okay.
Yeah, a couple of years later, he started and basically followed a similar model. Yeah.
And it makes a lot of sense, of course, because, then you can see it's really about sick people and making them feel better,
It makes me very nostalgic. It's sad that the Compassion Club actually closed 2 months ago. It survived for 26 years, and it survived through 4 years of legalization in Canada, where it was not operating inside the regulations. It was not getting cannabis from licensed producers, but eventually economic forces eventually forced it to close only 2 months ago. My baby.
And that's really such an irony that in the end it was not, prohibition or the law, the police that ended it.
Never raided.
But just capitalism, basically.
Yeah, never raided, never busted, never arrested.
In
not
all
for
those
the work
26
of the
years is amazing, eh?
Yeah.
No, we worked very hard to have relationships with our neighbors, relationships with the local schools, with the local police, and then with the cancer agencies and the HIV and AIDS organizations and the arthritis organizations and the local municipal government, and then eventually the provincial government, and then eventually the federal government. And we had great success in the courts also. So the people who operated the organization never faced any criminal consequences, but our growers and suppliers did.
Yeah.
So I have been in court a lot.
Yeah, because that's another
Protecting
thing.
growers
That
and suppliers.
if you are the first one, and so for a period of time the only one, I can imagine that so many people will be drawn to this one place where they can get actual cannabis. So how was it you had to scale up, I would say, and get maybe more growers, or how did it work?
I remember at one point we had like a 3 or 4 month wait list.
Yeah.
Because it took that long to do the intake sessions, because you can only intake so many patients at a time, because we would do an hour and a half intake because there's a lot of education. And we never franchised. We never opened second or third locations. But
was it a big hassle to get enough weed, basically?
In the beginning,
Yeah.
growers and dealers wanted nothing to do with me because I was such a heat score, because I was public, right? They wanted nothing to do with me. So I had a very dear friend, Mark Richardson, who you may know as Bubble Man, who's kind of a famous Canadian cannabis guy. He was my shopper because he was like quality control, and he would go and find super clean, super high quality, no chemical, really good grade cannabis for us. And he was the first person who got busted. So he got busted with, I don't know, a couple of kilos and I think $8,000 or $9,000. And we went to court. And that was the first time that we went to court to defend a supplier.
Yeah.
And we brought the patients out who came and testified about what we were doing. And we had pretty stringent requirements for how to become a member. It wasn't a free-for-all. And that court case, Judge Parody, he ruled that the Compassion Club was akin to a local neighborhood pharmacy, that it was not a recreational drugstore, that it was serving the community in a very meaningful way. And the best line ever, the cannabis has to come from somewhere. It's not going to fall out of the sky like manna from heaven. And he gave Mark, basically, we had already pled guilty, so this was just in the sentencing part, because we were saying, yes, we did this.
Yeah.
So gave him a suspended sentence, which means like no consequence really. And the coolest part was he ordered the cops to give us the money back, which never happens. We got the bank back. But that case became,
What year was this, to put it in perspective?
98.
Okay.
99 maybe?
So
Maybe 99.
Indeed, I think the law changed for medical in 2001 in Canada. Yeah.
So we were in court a few times before that,
Yeah.
defending growers. And the Richardson case was the cornerstone case law of starting to have the judicial recognition of the necessity argument around access to medical cannabis. And all of our other supplier cases were built off the Richardson case. And eventually that body of case law became the foundation of the challenges at the higher courts that Kirk Toussaint and John Conroy and all of the other awesome lawyers in Canada fought like hell to force our government, kind of force the government, like kicking and screaming and dragging and protesting, to start implementing a medical system.
Yeah. Because this was before Trudeau, eh?
Yeah. This was in the Harper era.
So more conservative government, but still they were forced to start with the medical. Yeah.
And every time the courts made a ruling, the government would do like one little inch,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And
Yeah.
not do a bunch of the other things in the ruling. They'd have to go back to court and like force them to do more. So back then in the beginning, 2001, it was essentially patients could grow their own. Right. And then eventually they argued that this is not adequate. They need to be able to get a supply. And then there was one government supplier, Prairie Plant Systems. They grew cannabis down in a deep, deep, deep mine because, it's so dangerous. And then it wasn't until 2012 that we got permission for there to be more licensed producers. And that's when the first
So that took 11 years to go from one to more producers.
Yeah. Wow.
I think that's
Yeah,
right.
but in the Netherlands, we are still waiting, eh?
True.
That's interesting that we legalized medical cannabis the same year as Canada in 2001. And even now, we're talking 2022, we only have Bedrocan. There are all kinds of... They are sort of trying to get one or more extra growers for the medical, but it's not working. Like Aurora is also trying to get in for the medical cannabis. But in some way, they have to start over the procedure and whatever. Still, no decision. So it
might not have been that long. I'll have to look it up. I think that the year that Prairie Plant Systems was licensed was maybe around 2006 or something.
Yeah, because I use it
know.
as an example, saying like in Canada, it's not, they just have competition, between the medical growers, which would always be good for the patients and for the system, you'd say. No, but before we get into the politics there, how long did you work at the Compassion Club? Were you there for most of the time until you got working for Aurora? Was there something in between?
Never Aurora. Was
Canopy
Growth.
Yeah.
Whoa.
Well, actually, you know what? Now that I don't work at Canopy anymore, I'm allowed to like the other companies. I just we're not fierce competitors anymore. I was there for about 15 years.
Okay.
And then when the first big 12 licenses were granted, and the landscape of medical cannabis was changing. And suddenly bigger companies, corporations were starting, big licenses were being given out. I decided that I wanted to shift and work in the corporate world. I wanted to be where the power and equity was. I wanted a seat at that table. I felt like I had a responsibility to have a seat at that table and to have as much influence as I could. And I took a lot of grief. I fell hard off my sort of activist pedestal.
Yeah.
And, social media was cruel. And some of my old colleagues in the cannabis world were just terrible to me.
You're a traitor.
Yeah, I was a big traitor. Yeah. But I always knew that they just didn't understand my strategy, and that I believed in wanting to create change from the inside.
Yeah.
And that one of us had to be at that table. And so actually it was Bedrocan that I started working with. So Bedrocan got one of those first 12 licenses.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was the director of patient education and advocacy.
Okay.
Created a patient stakeholder group and did a bunch of very cool work. And then it was the first big merger and acquisition. So a company named Tweed bought Bedrocan.
Yeah.
And that was when Canopy Growth was born.
So now we get to know how that all went. That's I never knew that, actually.
Yeah.
That
Me
it's-
neither. Yeah.
It's a direct line to the Netherlands, you could say.
Again.
With Bedrocan.
Yeah.
And also having worked there, that's very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and then I worked my way into becoming the first female member of the C-suite at Canopy Growth, and held that position for a number of years and did some very phenomenal work. I had a very good run at Canopy.
Yeah, because tell me, when you went in, like you say, you need representation, you need activists to be inside the legal system. I would agree with that. What were sort of your ideas or goals or things that you wanted to prioritize from your own background as an activist?
Well, in the first couple of years was prior to recreational legalization. So it was a lot of physician education.
Yeah.
And that was really exciting, working with like a sales team of people that were going in and talking to doctors all over the country, and to be able to help advise around some of the content. And I created, a patient handbook, a guidebook for helping to teach patients how to dose really carefully and how to avoid the cumulative effects of edibles.
Yeah.
And, took all of our practical experience and made it a formula and made it simple. I worked with 2 other patient organizations to create a patient stakeholder group, and we forced the government's task. So the government had a task force on legalization that toured the country, interviewing all kinds of stakeholders and experts to decide what the recommendations were to how to legalize for recreation, and they weren't meeting with patients. And so we kind of forced them to.
Yeah.
And we got to organize this amazing day where the people who were leading this task force all came and spent a day with patients.
Wow.
And we got to write the agenda and lead the meetings. And we're told that those meetings really changed the direction of some of the key pieces of the regulatory framework, because they needed to hear from the patients.
Yeah.
We had a police officer who used to work in homicide who was using cannabis to manage his PTSD, and a whole range of incredible patients. So that was very important to me. And then heading into legalization, my job changed a little bit, because suddenly we needed to be working with and educating people who were used to distributing liquor to teach them how to distribute cannabis,
Yeah.
because some of the way that cannabis was going to be distributed through the different provinces, many of the provinces of Canada chose to do it through the branches that had once been focused solely on liquor. So now we're making online courses, and we're starting to teach people about what is cannabis, what are the different strains, what's the difference between ingesting and inhalation, and what are the things you need to teach a consumer. And there's a lot of ramp up to legalization in October of 2018.
Because you could, in every state, you could order it through the internet, I think, from the beginning, or not? Yeah.
Yeah, through
through these
in the medical framework, you were always ordering online or ordering over the phone. And then in the recreational framework, it changes a little bit province to province. So it's some combination of a government website. Some provinces also have government stores, like a government liquor store. Some provinces have private retail, right? So you can be a cannabis company that starts your like basically storefronts. Most of the provinces all have this system where you have a provincially managed wholesaler. So the license, like a middleman, right?
Yeah.
So the licensed producers sell into the government middleman, and then the retailers have to buy from that middleman.
I think actually this system is set up for medical in the Netherlands like that, where you have the Bureau of Medical Cannabis, and Bedrocan sells actually to the Bureau to make it official, and from there they go to dispensaries or something.
Well, I have to say, I think that system was for me. I can explain a little bit better. I was like in 2019. I went to Canada to smoke some legal cannabis. I was super excited, and I went to the Fire and Flowers in the dispensary, and I was super excited. And I bought some kosher kush from DNA Genetics and from the and it was all just brown cannabis.
Too old.
It was super old. And then I checked the package of the date of packaging. It was 11 months ago. So the weed was already 11 months in the plastic container. And the shop owner, the guy who worked there, he excused him for it, but he said, the waiting times at that middleman to test all the cannabis takes so long that this is the weed we get. So
because now I think there are different problems with the regulation in Canada, that there's more like overproduction. Or what would you say?
Did they change it? The system?
I mean, it's improving.
Okay.
I'd say there's like incremental improvements. I do want to go back at some point and talk about some of the very cool things that I got to do at Canopy that I'm proud of the company and myself for doing. But when you want to start talking about some of the problems with legalization?
Also, what interested me is also like, okay, so you had the medical from 2001. Were you like surprised that it took until 2018 to legalize adult use? Did you think it would come sooner, or were you surprised that it actually happened?
I didn't think it was going to happen under the conservative government that we had, right? But there's no constitutional argument to require legalization of recreational use, where there is a constitutional argument around the access for medicine, right? Yeah. So then Justin Trudeau, he ran on it as his election platform. Right. So he said, vote for me. I'm going to legalize cannabis. He mobilized the youth vote and won the election.
Yeah, he pulled it off.
Right. Yeah, he pulled it off. and then he followed through on it.
Okay, so you were surprised that it did come in 2018, you could say.
I was glad that we got there. Yeah.
Okay.
Enough of criminalizing people and ruining lives over this plant.
No, well, indeed. Before we get into that, to keep it in a good chronological order, you explained also with the patients and getting the patients together with the policymakers is obviously very important, and I think it never happened in the Netherlands. What are other kinds of projects and campaigns, maybe like that?
Well, I pitched to my boss that he should level me up in the company, because there were very few female leaders, not just in my company, but across the whole industry. So when we were a movement, the face of the movement, there were a lot of women who were supporting patients, taking on the risk. And when it became an industry overnight, it was primarily white men who were leading all of these companies. So they're in the positions of power, but also equity, right? They're in the positions where they're getting big chunks of equity in these companies that are all starting to go public, and also the big fat salaries, right? And so it was not diverse. in terms of, people who are brown and black, but also in terms of women, right? So I told him that, it was time for us to start working on our diversity, equity, and inclusion work inside Canopy, which has really become like a common theme that companies the companies are trying to work on, because the face of the companies, especially the ones that are starting to make some money in the States, and it's not reflective of, basically the people who have been disproportionately punished by prohibition, black, brown, indigenous, are disproportionately excluded from the benefits of legalization. Yeah. Right. And companies have taken a lot of criticism. There's a lot of heat on it. So most cannabis companies have a diversity program to make sure that the staff and the leaders have some diversity, and also do some kind of social justice programming. Yeah. Right. So I got that program started inside Canopy and eventually hired somebody who knows a lot more about running diversity, equity, and inclusion in the corporate world than I do. But I spent a couple $1 million over the years on some incredible social justice initiatives, working with a grassroots organization in the US who's working on record clearing. We did some great patient partnerships in Canada, working on physician guidelines. And in fact, they're going to be published in like a couple of weeks. This is a project that I started 4 years ago with the Canadian AIDS Society, and they worked with many of the best physicians across the country to do the most comprehensive clinical guidelines for physicians around all different kinds of pain, whether it's cancer pain or chronic pain or arthritis pain or acute pain. And it was very expensive and a long time, but it's finally about to be published in a reputable journal. So even though I'm not with Canopy anymore, I'll be very excited about that. Yeah. And then most recently, my team led Canopy's first environmental, social, and justice and governance report. So an ESG report is something that big institutional investors and even small retail investors are really starting to look for. Yeah. Your ESG report basically goes through all your risk mitigation around, your diversity, how you treat your staff, all of your health and safety. But then very importantly, it's asking companies to start reporting on carbon output, water output, waste management, right?
Should be a very big theme for producing companies, especially. Yeah.
And the old corporate culture, you kind of keep all those dirty secrets hidden behind a curtain, right? And the new corporate culture that the world is demanding because of,
open up about
because of climate change, and consumers want to know how responsible is the company that I'm supporting. What are your values? What do you stand for? Right? What are your commitments? And are you going to keep those commitments? So we, with the help of some consultants, conducted the first environmental footprint assessment, which was very difficult to do, actually, because the data management systems weren't in place. Yeah. It's one piece of advice I would give to companies looking to go legal in Europe is right away start thinking about implementing, as you're building your company, the data management systems that you're going to need to report on ESG, because it's going to become more and more mandatory for all companies, especially once they go public. So that was very exciting. That was a huge amount of work to create that report, but also to shift the consciousness and the culture of the board and the leadership to get everybody on board with the fact that it's time necessary to be transparent. So we were the first big publicly traded cannabis company to report on our environmental footprint, and that will kind of become the benchmark that other companies will report against. And it was a very, we didn't set target. I shouldn't say we, because I'm not working with Canopy anymore, but they didn't set targets, which is really what the next step is to say, this is where we are and this is what we're going to do to start reducing our carbon footprint, because factory production of indoor cannabis is basically an environmental nightmare. Right? So Yeah,
And
so
I think-
anyway, those are some of the highlights of
wow.
the things, and I'm grateful for the experience. You know, I spent 2 years as a C-suite level executive. You know, basically, I went from the courtroom to the boardroom. I made that journey, and
Yeah.
I learned a tremendous amount. And the original leadership at Canopy were incredibly supportive. They really valued my input. I think also something that's important for companies in Europe that are thinking about heading into hopefully this new emerging legal market is having legacy growers or activists or people who have credibility in the cannabis community is really important as a part of the personality and the brand of your company, because those people have authenticity with your consumer.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's very interesting to see how that pans out in the Netherlands with the weed experiment. I think it's already happening a bit like that. The smarter companies, they do realize this, of course, and hire people that have been active a long time. So, yeah. Let's where we left off before this, saying what's good about the regulation, the legalization for the adult use in Canada and what's not so good. I always had the idea it's logical for Trudeau and his government. They know the whole world is watching, that they make really quite a tight regulation to start with, if only to stop a lot of criticism from other countries going, crazy, you can buy 100 grams, Do you think that was behind it? And can you explain a bit about that? Like, how did they do it, and what did they get right and what did they get wrong?
I think that there were some compromises in order to sell legalization to the conservative parts of our government that still had a fair amount of power when in Trudeau's cabinet, and in our House of Commons and in the Senate. There are still the kind of law and order old school people that had power, and so they had to find some compromises, right? I mean, there's a brilliant bureaucrat named Eric Costin who led the task force that toured the country. And then they all got locked in a room for a week and tried to narrow down all of this conflicting advice around what the regulatory scheme should look like. So in the end, I think the fundamental error, something that I would like to see other countries not do, is I believe that we legalized cannabis with a prohibitionist mentality. We didn't say, oh my God, the war on drugs has been a disaster. It's been ruining individuals and families' lives, and it's been disproportionately punishing and jailing Indigenous, brown, and Black people. Oh crap, this prohibition business is actually based in racism and lies that, the America came up with and very successfully exported around the world. And we're sorry for all the harm it's done, and we're going to roll it all back and start from the beginning.
That's what they should have done.
It should look like.
It was
right?
the best market thing ever, I think they did, with making drugs illegal.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, you could say it like that, of course. Yeah.
So we couldn't do that in order to sell legalization to the conservatives, and also looking at the concerns around international treaties and such things. So the fundamental pillars of the argument was, we're going to reduce the harms of cannabis, right? Legalizing cannabis, we're going to reduce the harms. We're going to keep it out of the hands of kids. We're going to keep the money out of the hands of the criminals. And we're going to make sure that it's not dangerous and contaminated.
Yeah.
Right. And then also one of the things that the government talked about was, we're going to correct the fact that prohibition has had a disproportionate impact on criminalizing Indigenous, brown, and Black communities.
Yeah, they never put that into the equation, really.
Well, they didn't put it into the equation because the regulations in the end had no caveats for equity programming, right? So there was no on-ramp or advantage or funding for businesses that were owned and run by those more impacted communities, which is what should have happened.
Yeah.
Yeah. But so that's a little bit on the critical side. I mean, I do want to say that I am incredibly proud of my country for doing this. You know, I think that even for people who don't consume cannabis and really don't care about if it's legal or not, they learned through some conversations around legalization and from presentations and media and things that this is not just about the right to get high.
Yeah.
This is about patient access. This is about social justice. This is about telling the truth. This is about standing up for the underdogs, whether they're patients or people who have been criminalized or just had their lives ruined by prohibition. And that is something to be incredibly proud of, right? The compassion and the kindness that should be a part of legalization, right? Really proud. And so guess what? 4 years later, the sky has not fallen.
Yeah.
The kids are not all turned into crazy zombie
kids
addicts.
Are okay.
People are not driving off the road in a onslaught of traffic accidents.
Jumping out of windows or
No.
whatever.
They might eat some more maple syrup.
Yes, some more potato chips. But I think it's really important that those are two of the biggest concerns that people generally have about legalization is, oh my God, what about the kids?
Yeah.
And then also driving, right? So any nation who legalizes, it's very important to have good baseline data. If you don't have good baseline data about traffic, driving,
To compare
youth
it to
use,
after you regulate, yeah.
yeah, you need good baseline data. And in many cases, we did have some very decent data. So 4 years later, what we do know is that youth use has not increased. And in fact, it's kind of boring. Like buying weed at a government store, it's kind of it's a little less exciting. And these are statistics that come from my government. So we know that youth use has not increased, but what has decreased is youth getting criminalized, right? So we've had a dramatic decrease in the age groups that are sort of under 18 of people ending up with possession charges or trafficking charges that could ruin somebody's life. You end up not being able to get into college. And so this is like a huge benefit to youth.
Because what does
right?
happen to you if you're underage and you do have cannabis now? Do you get a fine or do you get nothing? Or I would say that that's what I heard very early on for the regulations, that if you sell to a minor, then
there's some consequences.
Yeah, but what if you are the minor that has bought it or got it from someone?
Yeah, I don't believe that it's written into the regs in terms of there being consequences for youth possession. But yes, there were increased consequences for somebody who is providing.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a lot of concerns about like if somebody was 18, so legal to possess, if they passed a joint to somebody who was 17 and not legal to possess, that then they could fall under this increased penalty. But I don't think that very many cases of that have happened. I mean, there are still people who are being arrested and convicted for illicit cultivation, for illicit trafficking. So it's not like there is no criminalization. There is still some criminalization of cannabis in Canada, but it's reduced, right?
And from the consumer perspective, are prices high? Are they low? How does that work out? There are a lot of shops, I know, by now, after 4 years. So
there are a lot of shops.
Yeah.
So there were 12 licenses in the beginning, those first medical licenses. And then more and more companies have been getting licenses. So right now there are about 500 licensed producers across the country.
Wow. That's a lot, eh?
And about 150 of them, it's actually 147, but are micros. And a micro license has slightly different requirements, but essentially your canopy can't be more than about 2,000 square feet. And so there is definitely a lot of product. I mean, what's happening in the market right now is there's kind of a race towards high THC and low cost. Right, that's kind of like what the pressures of the market are, and so high quality trips, we used to call them in my day, AAAs.
But with the high THC content,
that still has like a premium price.
Yeah, that surprises me. Because you could argue that if you have so much more variation and legal production, people would maybe tend to go more for a very good terpene profile, not so much just the biggest bang for the buck, as they say.
I think that there are definitely those sophisticated consumers who
but
that's
not
what
the
they're
majority.
looking for. What I know from what the statistics about the market is telling us in terms of what people are consuming and are purchasing the most of is people are looking for a high potency and low cost. And it's not how I shop.
No,
I don't need the super, super strong.
No.
But, there are some kind of like fundamental issues that need to be resolved, right? So while I'm very proud of my country for what we've done, because we legalized still with a prohibitionist mentality, the industry is overregulated and overtaxed, right? So in the beginning, there are these huge barriers to entry to be able to get into the legal market, right? You needed a huge amount of capital to be able to build a facility that was like Fort Knox. And all of the, because it's so overly regulated, the operations are expensive because you have to report on all of these things. Everything is very specific about the way that you have to do things to follow the regulations. There's these tax stamps that have to go on the packages that are different if your package is going to different provinces. Like, just the operations are expensive. And the amount of surveillance that's required and security and measures to avoid diversion, where we're basically treating cannabis like, I wouldn't say quite like plutonium, but maybe like a dangerous virus.
Yeah.
They're very expensive, right? And so the costs of operations are very high because of the overregulations. And then the taxes are incredibly high, right? So there's a federal tax, there's a provincial tax. I mean, there's a huge amount of media in Canada right now because the regulations are going through a review process.
Yeah.
And what producers, especially smaller producers, are saying is that we're all going to be dead in a year if you don't stop taxing us to death.
Yeah.
Right? And so with the over-regulation, the stringent regulations of the way that the people are producing and operating, all of the reporting, and it creates advantages for the unregulated market.
Yeah.
Right? Because they're not policed in the same way in terms of having to spend money on all of this hypervigilance, And I think that brings up another issue that I think fundamentally we got wrong in the beginning, that I hope that other countries will not get wrong, is this notion of competing with the illicit market, right? That the regulated market has to compete with the illicit market. If we can move to a place where we can be progressive enough with our thinking, where we can think about creating an inclusive market as much as possible from the beginning. I'm not saying that hardened criminals should be included, but
it's a very important point.
But if you have a record for cultivation, possession, or distribution that's not an insane amount, this should not keep you out of the unregulated market, because the barriers that we put in place that kept many legacy growers out of it in the beginning,
system,
those huge barriers that were like, you need to have QPICs, quality people in charge. So these are like very, very highly qualified, extremely expensive people that have to like be in the room as the batches are moving through the facility. Just the incredible amount of capital that's needed, like I said, to build up the facilities and build out all the security.
This reminds me so much of how the weed experiment is set up. It's basically, it's not that you need a whole lot of capital up front, but like you say, if you want to adhere to all these rules,
It's expensive.
That makes it expensive for the personnel and for the way you have to build your facility and all this.
So in the beginning, it was an advantage for the companies that were able to move quickly, write out your standard operating procedures, put these huge, complicated, very in-depth applications in. And those were pieces of operating a cannabis business that some great old school quality growers couldn't they couldn't check those boxes, right? Now all of those requirements are basically eating the lunch of the licensed companies. So the things that were an advantage in the beginning for bigger players to be able to move quickly to get these licenses are now costing so much that a lot of companies are losing money. Like very few of the big companies in Canada are reporting profits, right? And some of the losses are like in the hundreds of millions. Wow. So the markets have dropped out, right? Like, Canopy traded at $70 a couple of years ago, and now I think they're at about $4, right? And there's just not a huge influx of investment into the space anymore because of these issues.
But of course, I would say the expectations were also too, inflated in the beginning. So it kind of makes sense that the bubble had to burst a bit, at least. But would you say that, like you said, there are like 180 craft growers that have a license?
147.
Okay, but
micros, we call them.
Yeah. And can they survive if they would not change too much with the rules after this evaluation process?
The Craft Growers Association is yelling very loudly at the government right now and saying, here's 4 or 5 things that you need to change in order for the small businesses to be able to continue to survive. One of them is about taxation, and the other ones are just some kind of simple procedural changes that would just make it a bit more affordable to be able to operate the businesses. But what's interesting is the micros, and they came on the scene a bit later, right? Like the regulations happened in phases. We had flour first, then it took a year, and then we had like edibles and concentrates and hashes and other things. And then slowly they started working out the classification and the licensing requirement for micros. Yeah. So the micros were really struggling to get into the market, but actually kind of like craft beer, like smaller production, smaller batches, a different kind of quality than maybe what you discovered or what can come out of factory production. And just this year, the micros are now responsible for supplying more than half the market.
Wow.
Right? So they called themselves I see some banter online about the micros being ankle biters.
Yeah.
But they're like slowly getting more and more market share. And the bigger companies are getting less and less and less market share, right? So like the 3 biggest companies a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, they were all kind of like between 30 and 40% of the market. And now they're all like under 10% of the market.
Yeah. Wow.
I'm also very curious about the native people. Because, for example, the statistics, how you say that? Statistics. Does it include the native people? Because they also grow a lot and they have their websites. And when I was in Canada, I could buy just legal, I think, on a website from the native people. And that quality was exceptional good.
Okay.
So they're
really good.
There are a couple of First Nations and Indigenous licensed producers, but it's complicated in Canada because we have issues around sovereignty, right? So there are First Nations and Indigenous communities that they're on land that really should be theirs or has been granted to them, and they don't recognize, it's a concept of nationhood, they don't actually recognize the governance of the federal government. And there are facilities that are producing cannabis that are not regulated under the federal system, but enforcement is complicated because it brings up all of the treaty issues that the country's facing around our First Nations and Indigenous folks.
Okay.
But I can tell you that it's one of the issues that was not addressed properly in the framework of the regulations in the beginning, is you can't sell legalization by saying we have to stop disproportionately punishing these communities with prohibition and then not create any kind of economic and financial on-ramp for them to have an advantage around getting licenses, and honestly for having support and funding to be able to build those businesses.
It's interesting that in the European and the Dutch context, we never talk about that really. The more affected
they
people.
never talk about, and I was also
because
surprised.
it could be that the way that we have handled it, especially in the Netherlands over the last 40 to 50 years, is not so much geared at the consumer and throwing them in jail. That might be, or the small dealers are not so much there because we have the coffee shops, but it's never included in the discussion here, even in Germany. And I think in Germany, what we talked about before, like what is your ecological thing if you grow, with all the electricity costs and all this. I think they're starting to do that in Germany, to keep track of that also, like you explained.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's very smart for companies to think about it as early as possible, because the longer you wait, the more expensive it becomes to do the work, right? And if you can build some of those systems into your, company from the beginning, then you have those processes set up, and as your company grows, those systems can grow rather than having to backtrack, right? And also, I would say that cannabis consumers would like to know that the company that they're producing cannabis from has some morals and values around carbon output and how polluting they are. I think that is climate anxiety becomes a part of our shared psychology, particularly for youth, that companies,
for sure,
companies that are not authentically and in a meaningful way addressing their impact are going to lose consumer loyalty, And one of the other challenges that I would like to talk about in the Canadian market is that we set it up with no branding, no advertising. It's very plain packaging, right? And I can understand from a public policy, from a public health policy perspective, why they wanted to do that. It's the same way that our cigarette packages are not allowed to have any kind of branding or anything anymore, right? But the problem is that I couldn't educate customers anymore. So basically the regulations work in a way where you get to have very little communication with your consumer as a producer, right?
Because it's all considered advertising, basically.
Yeah, all considered advertising. So the retailers, at the point of sale, they can do some education, but I couldn't create pamphlets and brochures and put them in the package that say, okay, this is an edible product. I recommend that you start with 2.5 milligrams. Make sure that you know what that feels like. Wait a whole day. Don't cumulatively dose. This is how you should step it up incrementally. We couldn't put that kind of content in the packages anymore.
That makes no sense, eh?
No. And I think that cannabis consumers would like to have a relationship with the producer or distributor that they're getting cannabis from, right? They want to know, what are the values? What do you stand for?
Yeah. I think that those are all lessons, not just for the Netherlands, but really for any country that goes down the path of legalization. One more thing is that, like you said, the evaluation process has just started, 4 years of legal adult use cannabis in Canada. Do you think there's political will enough to actually make the regulations a lot better and to listen to the industry and to the people that are concerned to change? Or
I sure hope so. I mean, it's hard to change laws once they're in place, right? It's so important during the consultation phase to make sure that the right experts are being heard from, and to use all of your political clout and to do everything you possibly can to make sure that the legislation is written right in the first place, because again, it's so hard to move and change legislation once it's already in law. And it's really tempting when it comes to cannabis prohibition to just be like, oh my God, I'll take any kind of legalization, whatever kind of legalization, we'll take it, right?
And then you're stuck with it, maybe,
and then
for longer than you like. Do you have any more questions, Rens? Because I'm looking at the time a bit. It's super interesting, but we have also some segments that we want to do on the episode. Do you have some more?
No, I'm good. I'm really. It was really nice hearing all those things, and also hearing the perspective of the Canadian side.
Absolutely.
So,
I think all our listeners learned a lot about.
Yeah. So I think we go to the next segment, the old box, Derek. And what's in the old box today?
Yeah, I went to my drug library and got out a classic drug book, I can say. It's called Drugs and the Mind, written by Mr. Robert S. de Ropp. And it has a lot of fantastic quotations in it, including quotations from the LaGuardia report, 1944. It's the actual official name of it is the Report of the Mayor's Committee on Marihuana, and like I say, it's published in the Second World War, 1944. By everybody seemed to have loved this mayor of New York, Fiorello LaGuardia, and he ordered a very big study. For this new phenomenon, basically, that so many people were talking about, and it was excerpted in this book, Drugs and the Mind. I'll read a section of it. Marijuana is generally used in New York City in the form of cigarettes, commonly called muggles or reefers. The cheapest brand is known as Sassafras, retails at 3 for about 50 cents. And is made from hemp grown in the United States. Smokers do not consider such marijuana very potent. A more potent brand of cigarettes is the Panatella, made from hemp grown in Central or South America. It retails for 25 cents. Still more potent is Gungeon, which is considered to be the highest grade of marijuana and is said to be imported from Africa. Although the name strongly suggests the Indian name of the drugs, ganja. Gungeon retails for about $1 per cigarette. Confirmed marijuana users can distinguish the quality and potency of various brands, just as the habitual cigarette smoker is able to differentiate between the qualities of tobacco. In New York City, most of the marijuana smoking appears to take place in the predominantly Negro section of Harlem. The investigators estimated that at that time there were about 500 of these tea pads in Harlem. They were in most cases comfortably furnished rooms with a radio, phonograph or a rented jukebox. The lighting was more or less uniformly dim, with blue predominating, and an incense burner was considered a natural part of the furnishings. Wow.
Really nice, Derek.
500 coffee shops they had in New York, just in the 1940s.
And blue was the predominant color
of
the environment.
And it had to be blue.
That's a very funny comment.
And also the panatella is, I think, a word that I will keep using for like not top class joint, but middle class joint. It's just the panatella.
Yeah, you have to. It's a hard word. It could be a nice name for a strain.
Yeah,
I think
panatella.
Yeah, I was just a bit making a little bit work for the listeners' responses, and I say, Simon, hit that button.
Hit
it. And as always, we ask our listeners to send us some nice requests or stories or whatever you like. We always like those responses. And a few days ago, we received an email from a Belgian guy. Dear gentlemen of the podcast, on one of my favorite topics in your podcast, what's in your joint today? I hear a lot of my favorite shop, the Tourmalijn. I worked for that coffee shop.
It's
So-
in Tilburg.
So that's why probably I talk a bit more about the coffee shop than. That is why I have also that is why I also have the question whether it might be possible to do a tourmaline special. I myself am a 23-year-old Belgian, and I personally think that this is really one of the best shops on the border of the country, where you are welcome as non-residents in the Netherlands by the government, at least. They say. I would like to thank you very much for the many hours of listening. I find them all intriguing. And instructive, especially when I'm enjoying the tourmaline on the cozy terrace at the moment in the morning.
Wow.
Kind regards, Sebastian.
I think it's a great suggestion, really.
Yes, it's really sparked my thought. It would be an excellent idea, also because of the NFT project.
Yep. Yeah, they just started with like a digital membership where it's all in the blockchain. And the idea is connecting not only just coffee shops, but also like social clubs in Barcelona want to be part of that system. They want to form this community. It's quite interesting.
Yeah. So thank you, Sebastian, very much for the suggestion. And I texted the tourmaline right away. So hopefully in a few weeks we can do like a tourmaline special.
Great, and you'll get, of course, the plant-related prize package sent to his home address
from seed stockers.
So,
and for everyone, if you have a question, anything, send it over to info at @HighTeaPodcast and podcast spelled with a T, .nl, or any comment in our Instagram DM, whatever you like, and we might choose one, and we'll win a nice prize package. All right, op to het Kweekhoekje.
Het High Podcast Kweekhoekje. Yeah, we are recording this episode on the 3rd of November, the day before the big PCN conference here. So I guess a lot of our listeners who grow outdoor weed have been trimming or are still in the process of trimming their 2022 crop. So we thought we give you a few tips about trimming, but also drying and storing your weed. Rens has already helped me out a bit with a few branches. I actually still have one plant. It's 3rd of November. Thanks to climate change, I think. I don't know what it is, but it's still alive and it's still in bloom. And it gives the studio a nice aroma, I think, to do the show. What's always, I think, good advice before you start trimming is really prepare well. And make sure that everything you are going to need you have. So like your glass jars, always store it in glass jars. That they are ready but also clean. You clean them out before. And you have some material to clean your scissors. Because that's of course the classic thing that will happen. Your scissors will get clogged. So you can use some normal olive oil for that. But also like cleaning alcohol. And you can rub the stuff off before you use this material, of course, to have some scissor hash.
Ooh.
Which is good, but so make sure that before you start, and also that you're in a good place to do it in a comfortable spot, because it always takes so much more time than what you think it will take. For me, a long time, there's this thing, of course, with growers. Do you trim dry or do you trim wet? And this is like an eternal discussion, what's better to do. But
it's not eternal.
No,
it also depends on how big your grow is. So, at some point, it's really hard to trim wet if you're taking down a huge amount of cannabis at the same time.
Yeah, but then I think it's always better to do dry trimming.
You think it's always better to do dry trimming?
Yeah, because it takes like some more time. Mm-hmm. So the drying process is like slower. So I think that's better than if
never cut when it's wet. Never trim when it's wet. Because you break the
trichromes?
No. It's the chlorophyll, the
Chlorophyll.
chlorophyll.
Yeah.
And then the weed tastes that like that, and it tastes like that. Well, it has to break off first, and then when it's dry, you can trim.
And I think the
It's
same.
as easy as wet.
God, I haven't trimmed in a long time. I've trimmed a lot of cannabis in my day. And you work your way into being the dryer mama, where you actually get to be responsible for moving things around and checking the batches and make sure that everything's drying just
And
right.
did you really hate the process? Because that's also on Twitter. I see it a lot. I hate trimming. There's only one thing I hate more than trimming. It's buying weed.
I
keep doing it.
I didn't like all the sitting. It's long days of sitting.
Yeah, that's why I said a good, comfortable
But
place.
I have friends now who trim for people that have micro licenses, and it's just like a normal job. Like you go to work, you work your 8 hours, and she's like, it's not like the old days where you got like paid by the pound, and the faster that you trimmed, the more you got paid, and there's all kinds of snacks and food and extras. Now it's just like go to work, trim
like a
for 8
lab.
hours, go home.
Office.
Yeah, going to the office, exactly.
Not that romantic, of course.
Can we talk about trimming for one more second?
Of course.
One of the finest growers that I ever worked with, who was a supplier of the Compassion Club, who actually has some history in Holland as well. He had the trimming table. The whole table was fine hash screen.
Yep.
And underneath was the plexiglass trays that you pull out. So, and he would be very angry if you would mess with the piles of hash underneath. And a couple times a day, he would come through and scoop it all up and separate it all out. But that was the best table for sure. It was the one with this big screen on it.
Yeah, but you really have to make it yourself, I think. You can't buy it like that.
I'm not sure if you can anymore. And I can now, but back then you certainly had to make it yourself. Yeah.
But that's a great tip if you can do it like that, of course. And that's I already mentioned, of course, try to keep it in glass jars. And then the first 2 weeks, I would say, super important. Burp your jars, so open them at least once every 24 hours. If your buds are still a bit too moist, then you don't have any trouble if you have some fresh air in the beginning of the curing process. And I would say good luck to everyone, and keep trimming.
Yeah, good luck the last weeks.
Of
And,
course, with the last advice I almost forget. Listen to our podcast, the
While
older
trimming.
episodes while trimming. That's almost why we make them.
Exactly. All right, that brings us to the end of episode 67 already of the High Tea podcast.
Time flew.
Would really like to thank our guest, Hilary Black, again, for being on the show. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, and thank you for running this in English. We wouldn't have gotten very far if you were trying to get me to do it in Dutch. So, but that was great. That was wonderful. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think it was a really, really great, informative episode. Best of luck at the conference, of course, tomorrow, the PCN Coffee Shop Conference. And thanks again to the sponsor of this episode, our good friends of Seed Stockers, affordable cannabis seeds for home growers, available at seedstockers.com.
Thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe us and recommend us to your friends so we can keep growing.
Houdoe.
Goodbye. Bye-bye.